Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm the co-coordinator of SOC1GIL. In this short video, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that sociologists have been thinking about artificial intelligence and its relationship to power. So, artificial intelligence, or AI, is software that uses algorithms and powerful processors to sift through vast amounts of data. So, it's able to make connections and look for patterns and pick things up that perhaps humans might miss. And of course, it can do all of this much more quickly. So, for example, you might think about your Netflix account and the algorithm that creates recommendations of different shows for you to watch. So this is obviously drawing on the previous things that you've been watching, but also how long you watched them for, how many episodes you watched, whether you liked them, and then the data of other users who watch similar shows. So what it's offering is personalization. And Netflix famously made 10 different versions of the trailer for House of Cards so that they could tailor different previews to different audiences. So in some ways, we've become pretty used to the presence of AI in our everyday lives, and we're not too surprised when we find out that, say, when we're shopping online and we're in the chat, that we're chatting to a bot. So it's become much more kind of usual. Other applications of AI, though, are perhaps a bit more surprising. So AI writes a lot of news articles, things like reporting on sports results, that kind of basic stuff. AI is producing music, there's an AI therapist, we have robots in aged care in Japan who are helping make conversation with people, and more, I guess, kind of concerningly, AI is also being used to decide who is approved for a loan and whether people's insurance claims are approved. So advocates argue that there are many benefits to AI. So it lowers costs, it reduces risks, arguably, it increases consistency and can enable new solutions to complex problems. So for example, in the diagnostic area, medical diagnosis, AI applications actually lower diagnostic errors by 85% in breast cancer patients. However, there have been some high-profile cases about the unintended consequences of the use of AI by companies and by governments that have led to concerns about automated inequality, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. So some of you might remember the robo-debt scandal, or the online compliance intervention used by Centrelink in recent years. So this was an automated debt assessment and recovery system used by Centrelink, and it was started in July 2016, and it replaced the manual system of people going through and calculating overpayments and issuing out debt notifications to clients. So this new system used AI to match reported income to tax records to get back overpayments. So the data matching design frequently led to errors, and in total there were 470,000 wrongly issued debts. And these were issued to people who often were in a very vulnerable position already and were unable to pay the debts. And the flow-on effects of that were often very significant, and people were impacted both financially and mentally with regard to this. So robo-debt was also criticised for its reverse onus, meaning that it was up to the claimants to disprove the debts. And as the sociologist Andrew Whelan has suggested, the system was essentially outsourcing the labour which was previously done by Centrelink to the clients, so making them do the work to produce the documentation to show that there had been an error. And as I said before, this was a particularly vulnerable group and many struggled to do this. So the media and activists and academics brought the issue to the attention of the broader public. And after 2 Senate inquiries and a successful class action lawsuit, the system was eventually found to be unlawful and was scrapped by the Morrison government. Now, the robo-debt scheme, which did not have appropriate safeguards in place, indiscriminately targeted some of Australia's most vulnerable people, causing significant and widespread harm and increasing disadvantage. And so Whelan suggests that this is a really telling example of how automation may exacerbate punitive welfare agendas. So another social scientist working in this space is Jathan Sadowski, and he's pictured here. So he is particularly interested in the social power of AI, and he writes frequently for the media and has a weekly podcast, which I've put a link to on the slide if you're interested. He works at the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, and his work focuses on the social impacts of digital technologies. And he recently posted on his blog an explanation of why he's so interested in these issues. So I'll just read you now what he said. As a social scientist, I'm often asked why I got into studying technology in the first place. It's not because, like so many people in tech, I enjoy staying up to date on the latest gadgets and emerging innovations, or because I want to use technology to solve the world's problems. No, I always answer truthfully that technology is not actually what I study. I'm far more interested in the material operations of power and authority in society. That is how some people get to exercise influence and realise their visions of what the world should look like, and often accumulate a lot of wealth along the way, while most of us don't have that ability or opportunity. So that's where Sadowski is coming from. So let's just talk about some of the things that he is concerned with regard to AI and power. So one of the issues is the quality of the data being used to train AI. And he points out in this article that I've got a picture of on the screen here that there's an old saying in computer science, which is garbage in, garbage out. And we've seen a number of examples where either incorrect data or biased algorithms have significantly impacted on people's lives. So, for example, when using AI technology in hiring decisions, there's evidence that AI are choosing men over better qualified women because the data that's used to train these systems is embedded with gender bias, which the AI then reinforces. Or you might think about the example that you've got in the reading this week from Ruha Benjamin, which is the example of Black hospital patients being allocated fewer resources than white patients due to the nature of the historical data being used. So another point Sadowski makes is that these technologies are largely controlled by a small group of people who are mostly white affluent men. So we have a homogenous group of people deciding on behalf of the broader population how AI should be trained and used. And this has prompted calls for the importance of better representation of diversity in the field of AI. A further inequality in the AI industry that Sadowski highlights is the exploitation of low-paid workers who are needed to clean and label the data that's used to train AI. And this is a concern that's also raised by Australian social scientist Kate Crawford in her new book, The Atlas of AI. So she calls this book an atlas because in the various chapters of the book, she takes us to the physical places where the pipeline of production of AI takes place. So she starts off in the mines where the minerals are mined, but also takes us to places like people working and doing the data cleaning, so the labourer is involved in the process. So one chapter is focused on this micro work of labelling and cleaning data, where distributed workforces are paid mere cents per task. This has been called ghost work because it's fairly hidden, because it's people from around the world logging into online platforms and taking on these repetitive digital tasks. And last year there were reports that came out that much of this work was being done by refugees in the Middle East and Africa with no security or rights and very poor pay. Another labour issue that Crawford raises is the surveillance of workers. So whether that be the software on your computer that keeps track of professionals who are working at home, or the kind of scanning systems that are used in the Amazon warehouses where every movement of workers is tracked and tallied. In a later chapter on data and classification, Crawford looks at the case study of ImageNet. So this is a huge set of images used for training AI. And ImageNet was conceptualized in 2016 to assist in machines learning image recognition. So just very briefly, in order for the AI to recognize images, the images need to be labeled and coded or categorized. So ImageNet harvested over 14 million images from the internet with no permissions involved at all. And so they had this data that then need to be categorized. And the problem they had was, who is going to do this? So it's a huge job. It's going to be very expensive. They originally planned to use uni students, but that was just not going to be viable. So their solution was to use crowd working. And the platform, Amazon Mechanical Turk, had recently been launched. So Mechanical Turk is a crowdsourcing website for businesses to hire remotely located crowd workers to perform discrete on-demand tasks that the computers are unable to do. So as I mentioned before, this attracted controversy because the workers were often paid just a few cents per task. Now, it's highly significant, Crawford argues, that it's the humans who are doing the labelizing and categorizing of the images that the machines learn from. Now, some of the categories that were created were pretty unproblematic, so things like apple or scuba divers or dog, but other images were tagged with really offensive and racist or sexist labels. And this is where you can see how the human values are baked into these systems. Another example that Crawford points to was the decision by ImageNet to classify gender as a binary, so they could only classify images as either male or female. And I'll quote Crawford here. She says, "The decisions to classify gender in this way are also naturalizing gender as a biological construct rather than a social one. And transgender or gender non-binary people become either non-existent or are placed under categories of sexuality. Reducing humans into binary gender categories and rendering transgender people invisible or deviant are common features of classification schemes in machine learning." So what you can see here is the way that the people who are in control of the data and the coding of the data into these systems are baking into it a particular set of values or a particular understanding of the way the world is. So to give the last word to Crawford, what this example of ImageNet shows us is that although training data sets pass as purely technical, they're actually highly humanized, so they contain political interventions within their taxonomies or their classification systems, and they naturalize a particular ordering of the world which produces effects that are seen to justify their original ordering. So she finishes off this chapter by making the point that actually machine learning systems in a very real way are constructing race and gender. They're defining the world within the terms they have set, and this has long-lasting ramifications for the people who are classified. In AI training then, we see the relationship between power and knowledge, which Michel Foucault argued were inextricably linked, where those with power to define the knowledge or create the discourse from which the AI learns are able to set the norms and values by which these systems then make decisions that considerably impact on people's life chances. Thank you.